Don't you leave your room until you apologize to your brother." My father shouted those words across the Thanksgiving dinner table. 20 relatives stopped eating. My aunt lowered her fork against her china plate. The sound echoed in the quiet room. My cousins stared down at his hands. My father, Richard Coleman, stood at the head of the table. He was a local real estate developer who treated every family gathering like a zoning board meeting he was destined to win. His face was flushed red. The vein in his neck pulsed against his collar. He pointed a finger at me like I was a criminal on trial. Sitting next to him was Julian, my older brother. Julian held a crystal wine glass. He kept his eyes fixed on the tablecloth, playing the victim perfectly. But I saw it. The faint, satisfied curl at the corner of his mouth. He was smiling, because he knew he had just orchestrated my ruin and our father was doing the heavy lifting for him. My name is Ariana Coleman. I am 23 years old. I am a junior actuary. I spend 50 hours a week in a downtown Atlanta office, calculating risk, projecting outcomes, and stripping the emotion out of catastrophic events. Panic is a variable I am trained to remove. So as the silence stretched, and the eyes of 20 relatives fixed on me waiting for a breakdown, I didn't give them one. I didn't yell. I didn't defend myself to an audience that had already bought tickets to my execution. I looked at my father. I looked at the brother who had just framed me for stealing $68,000. I pushed my chair back. The wooden legs scraped against the hardwood floor. I stood up, placed my linen napkin neatly beside my plate, and said one word: "Fine." I turned and walked out of the dining room. I felt their stares burning into my spine as I climbed the grand staircase. My father thought he was punishing me. He thought sending me away like a disobedient teenager would break my spirit and force a confession. He didn't know that my response wasn't a retreat. It was a calculation. The next morning, he opened my bedroom door to demand his apology. He found a stripped bed, empty drawers, and bare walls. Exactly 3 hours later, the family estate lawyer walked up our driveway. His hands were shaking. He held a legal document that would evaporate my father's entire empire. Before I tell you how I legally evicted my own father and brother from the house they thought they owned, please take a second to like this video and subscribe. Only do it if you genuinely connect with my story. Let me know in the comments if you have ever had to cut off toxic blood to save your own life. Now let me take you back to the numbers. To understand how we reached that Thanksgiving dinner, you have to understand the math of my childhood. In the Coleman family, blood did not matter. Only the ledger did. Julian was the firstborn son. That meant he was the investment. I was the tax. When Julian turned 17, my father bought him a $55,000 sports car. When I turned 17, my father handed me a printed schedule for the Chatham County public bus. Julian went to an out-of-state university. My father funded his tuition, his rent, and his fraternity dues. Nobody asked for a receipt. I stayed local. I signed my name to $42,000 in student loans. To cover my textbooks and groceries, I worked nights doing the bookkeeping for my father's real estate development firm. I logged hours. I balanced accounts. I never asked for a handout. I accepted the dynamic. I treated living at home after college as a business arrangement. I paid down my debt while they lived their lives. My father reinforced the divide every chance he got. Julian's reckless mistakes were always framed as learning experiences. When Julian crashed that sports car into a retaining wall, my father called the insurance company and blamed the road conditions. When I won a state mathematics scholarship, my father looked up from his newspaper, nodded once, and asked if I had finished logging his quarterly tax receipts. I learned early to celebrate quietly. I learned to need less. I watched my brother grow into a man who believed actions had no consequences as long as he had our father to write the check or point the finger at someone else. Julian learned he could get away with anything. I just didn't realize how far he would go until the firm's escrow account came up short. To understand how the firm's escrow account became the weapon that severed my family, you first have to understand the environment that made such a betrayal possible. As an actuary, I spend my life analyzing data to predict future events. We look at historical patterns to determine risk. The historical pattern in the Coleman household was glaringly simple. Julian was the high-yield asset, I was the liability. My father built this dynamic systematically. He psychologically conditioned me to believe my primary function was to facilitate his life and my brother's success. Every conversation was a subtle reminder that I was a secondary citizen taking up space in his kingdom. He framed Julian's most reckless decisions as necessary learning experiences. When Julian decided to drop out of his university for a semester because the coursework was too demanding, it cost my father $12,000 in lost tuition. My father took him to a steakhouse to celebrate finding his true path. When Julian decided he wanted to start a consulting business at 21, my father handed him $30,000 in seed money. Julian spent it on trips to Miami and expensive dinners. My father called it a networking expense. My ledger looked very different. When I asked my father for $300 to register for my first professional actuarial exam, he refused. He sat behind his heavy oak desk, adjusted his watch, and told me I needed to learn the value of hard work. He said handing me the money would rob me of my ambition. So I worked an extra shift at a local coffee shop to pay the fee myself. I scored in the 99th percentile. I brought the printed result home and set it on the kitchen counter. My father glanced at the paper, took a sip of his coffee, and told me not to let a test score go to my head, because the real world required soft skills. Skills he frequently claimed I lacked. I accepted this cold indifference. I did not fight back, cry, or beg for his approval because fighting implies you want to save the relationship. I did not want to save it. I just wanted to survive it. I treated my presence in that house as a strict business arrangement. I stayed under his roof after college for one specific, highly calculated reason. I needed to eliminate my student debt. Rent for a safe one-bedroom apartment in Savannah cost nearly $2,000 a month. Add utilities, groceries, and internet, and I would be losing $25,000 a year just to breathe free air. By staying in my childhood bedroom, I could redirect 80% of my corporate paycheck directly toward my loan principal. I created a spreadsheet that tracked every single penny. I knew exactly how many months, weeks, and days I had left until my balance hit zero. I turned my bedroom into a holding cell. I took down all the posters from high school. I packed away the personal items. I lived out of 2 suitcases and a single dresser drawer. I wanted to be ready to leave with zero notice. I treated my father and my brother like unpredictable landlords. I left for my corporate office before they woke up, and I returned long after they finished dinner. I minimized my footprint. I learned that silence was the cheapest way to buy peace. But my silence gave Julian a false sense of security. He confused my quiet discipline with weakness. He thought I was oblivious to the way the real estate firm actually operated. He forgot that during my college years, I was the one doing the low-level bookkeeping for my father's company. I knew the internal software. I knew the account structures. I knew the vendor codes. Julian was handed the title of senior project manager the day he graduated with a business degree he barely passed. His starting salary was $85,000. He was given a company credit card and a dedicated parking spot. He was supposed to oversee the development of commercial properties, but mostly he just played golf with local contractors. I saw his expense reports during my time in the accounting department. I saw him charge personal bar tabs and weekend getaways under the guise of site inspections. When I pointed out these discrepancies to my father, he told me to mind my own business and just enter the data. He said I lacked the vision to understand corporate relationship building, so I stopped pointing out the bleed. I left the bookkeeping job, finished my degree, and secured my actuary position in Atlanta. I commuted, worked my spreadsheet, and kept my head down. But the firm was built on a fragile foundation, and the real estate market was beginning to shift. Interest rates climbed. My father's bridge loans became expensive. The profit margins on his development projects shrank. The easy money disappeared, and the pressure in the house changed. A third-party financial auditing firm was scheduled to review all of my father's escrow accounts for a new round of commercial funding. That is when Julian's behavior shifted. He stopped going out on Friday nights. He stopped bragging about his golf scores. He spent hours locked in his home office, the glow of his computer screen visible under the door late into the night. He started lingering in the kitchen when I was making my morning coffee. He asked me casual, seemingly harmless questions about the firm's old accounting software. He wanted to know how long the company kept digital records of employee logins. He asked if the system tracked individual keystrokes or just the final transfer authorizations. I stood by the sink holding my cheap ceramic mug and looked at my brother. I told him the truth. I told him the system logged every single IP address, location, data point, and timestamp for every transaction. I watched the color drain from his face. His jaw tightened. He quickly changed the subject and walked out of the room. I am an actuary. I process data points. I noted his panic and filed it away. I did not know the specifics of his mess yet. I did not know he had developed a severe sports gambling addiction. I did not know he owed money to people who did not send polite collection letters. And I certainly did not know he was already planning to use my old accounting credentials to frame me for a missing $68,000. I just knew a storm was gathering. The numbers in my spreadsheet showed I was exactly 2 months away from paying off my final student loan. I just needed to hold the line a little longer, but Julian could not wait. The audit was approaching and he needed a scapegoat. He needed someone disposable. He chose me. The preliminary findings from the financial audit landed on my father's desk exactly 14 days before Thanksgiving. I was sitting in my cubicle in Atlanta running probability models on commercial freight insurance, entirely unaware that a trap had just been set in Savannah. In commercial real estate development, there are operational funds and then there are escrow accounts. Operational funds pay for marketing campaigns, office supplies, and employee salaries. Escrow accounts hold client deposits, earnest money, and construction draws. Escrow is a sacred line. Mismanaging operational funds makes you a bad businessman. Touching escrow funds makes you a felon. The third-party auditors found a glaring discrepancy in a primary escrow account attached to a large-scale retail park project. $68,000 had vanished. It did not trickle out in small increments. It was wired out in 3 distinct transactions over a 4-week period. Julian had authorized those wires. My brother had developed a severe sports betting habit during his college years, a vice my father had routinely dismissed as boys being boys. But Julian was not placing casual $50 bets on Sunday football games. He was leveraging thousands of dollars on complex parlays using unregulated offshore sportsbooks and local bookmakers. He was chasing losses. He would place a $10,000 wager on a college basketball game just to cover a $5,000 deficit from the previous night. The mathematics of gambling dictate that the house always wins, but Julian possessed the arrogance of a man who had never faced a real consequence. By late October, his losses had compounded into a suffocating debt. The bookies he owed did not care about his title as senior project manager. They made phone calls. They mentioned our home address. Julian was backed into a corner of his own design. He panicked. He knew the financial audit was mandatory and inevitable. He needed a temporary fix to satisfy his creditors. He intended to borrow the $68,000 from the escrow account, win it back, on a guaranteed bet, replace the funds before the audit, and walk away clean. That is the delusion of every desperate gambler. He lost the stolen money within 48 hours. Knowing the missing funds would trace directly back to his department, Julian shifted from panic to self-preservation. He remembered our brief conversation in the kitchen. He remembered my warning about IP addresses and system logs. He realized he needed a digital shield. When I left my bookkeeping job at the firm to finish my degree, the company never deactivated my administrative credentials. It was a careless oversight by an IT contractor, a forgotten string of code left active in the server. Julian found my old login details written on a faded sticky note tucked in the back of a desk drawer I used to occupy. Late at night, after the office had emptied out, Julian accessed the accounting terminal. He logged in using my username. He routed the $68,000 through a dummy vendor account he had set up under a fictitious consulting LLC named Apex Solutions. He had paid a registered agent online to file the paperwork masking his ownership. He authorized the transfers and bypassed the secondary approval protocol using my forged digital signature. On paper, it looked like I had logged in remotely, bypassed the security measures, and siphoned the money into an untraceable shell company. But a digital paper trail is only as strong as the scrutiny it withstands. Any competent forensic accountant would immediately notice the login originated from the firm's internal network, not from my IP address in Atlanta. They would see the MAC address belonged to Julian's company-issued laptop. Julian knew this. He knew the raw data would eventually convict him if anyone looked closely, so he did the only thing he could do. He relied on the strongest force in our family dynamic. He relied on my father's confirmation bias. Julian did not wait for the auditors to present the final report. He struck first. He walked into my father's corner office the morning the preliminary discrepancy was flagged. I was not in the room, but I know exactly how the performance unfolded because my father would later throw every single detail in my face during his interrogation. The physical environment of my father's office was designed to intimidate. Dark cherrywood heavy leather chairs and a panoramic view of the Savannah riverfront. It was a room where deals were dictated, not negotiated. Julian knew how to play the acoustics of that room. He closed the heavy door behind him. He stood in front of the desk, his shoulders slumped, his face pale. He manufactured a slight tremor in his hands. He looked my father in the eye and let his voice crack. He claimed he had been working late reviewing the quarterly vendor ledgers to prepare for the auditors when he stumbled across something horrifying. He handed my father a printed stack of transfer logs. The logs clearly displayed my username and my digital signature, attached to the missing $68,000. My father stared at the paper. The amount was substantial enough to derail his upcoming bridge loan renewals. He demanded an explanation. Julian delivered the fatal lie. He claimed he had confronted me about the discrepancy the previous weekend. He spun a narrative so entirely fabricated it sounded like a cheap daytime drama. He told my father I was secretly funding a lavish lifestyle in Atlanta. He said I was funneling the stolen money to pay for luxury apartment deposits, designer clothes, and expensive vacations I was taking under the radar. Julian pointed to my behavior at home as proof. He twisted my quiet discipline into evidence of guilt. He told our father that I stayed in my bedroom not to study or save money, but to hide my illicit activities. He claimed my frugality was just a front, a deliberate act, to throw everyone off the scent of my actual greed. He finished the performance with a masterstroke of emotional manipulation. He forced tears into his eyes. He told my father he was heartbroken. He said he had tried to convince me to put the money back, but I had threatened to frame him if he exposed me. He painted himself as the loyal son caught in an impossible moral dilemma, forced to choose between protecting his sister and saving the family business. If my father had possessed an ounce of analytical reasoning, the entire story would have collapsed instantly. Why would I steal money to fund a lavish lifestyle while simultaneously working 50 hours a week and eating canned soup in my childhood bedroom? Why would I route stolen funds using my own traceable username? Why would I leave the money in an active escrow account right before a scheduled financial audit? The math did not add up. The risk profile was absurd. But my father did not want to do the math. Doing the math would mean looking critically at his firstborn son. It would mean admitting that the boy he had funded, protected, and elevated was a criminal who had jeopardized the entire real estate empire. My father built his identity on the illusion of control. A missing $68,000 threatened to shatter that illusion. If the bank withdrew their funding, the retail park project would collapse. His reputation in Savannah would crumble. He needed a solution that preserved his image. Blaming his hand-picked successor would make him look foolish to his investors. Blaming his quiet, distant daughter made him look like a tragic victim of family betrayal. My father desperately needed Julian to be innocent. He needed a scapegoat to absorb the failure. I was the perfect candidate. I was the liability. I was the daughter he already resented for refusing to conform to his expectations. Believing I was a thief required zero emotional effort on his part. It simply confirmed the narrative he had been writing in his head for 23 years. He looked at the printed logs. He looked at Julian's carefully constructed tiers. He did not call the IT department to verify the login locations. He did not ask the auditors to trace the routing numbers on the dummy LLC. He did not even look at my bank statements. He simply accepted the lie as undeniable truth. The trap was set, the narrative was locked. My father now had a justifiable reason to unleash decades of quiet resentment. He picked up his phone and summoned me to his office. He was ready to act as judge, jury, and executioner. He thought he was preparing to discipline a rogue employee. He had no idea he was stepping into a financial grave. I drove down from Atlanta that Thursday afternoon. The coastal highway gave way to the sprawling oaks of Savannah. My phone buzzed with a terse text from my father, directing me to report to his home office the minute I arrived. I carried my overnight bag through the foyer, dropped it by the stairs, and walked down the hall. The heavy mahogany door was already open. He stood behind his expansive desk. He did not say hello. He did not ask about my drive or offer me a glass of water. He picked up a thick manila folder and tossed it across the leather blotter. The papers spilled out across the surface. "Sit down," he commanded. I took the chair opposite him. I looked at the pages. They were printed internal audit logs from the firm. $68,000, he said. His voice was dangerously quiet. "You routed it to a dummy vendor." He did not ask a question. He delivered a verdict. I picked up the top sheet. I saw my old bookkeeping username. I saw the digital transfer authorizations. I felt a brief spike of adrenaline, a natural human response to a direct threat. But my professional training took over. I breathed in, slowing my heart rate. I viewed the paper not as an indictment, but as a compromised data set. "I did not authorize this," I said. My voice remained level. I reached into my tote bag and pulled out my laptop. I set it on the desk and opened the screen. I did not waste time getting emotional or raising my voice. I relied on verifiable facts. I connected to the local network and pulled up my corporate access logs from my Atlanta employer. "Look at the dates, Dad. Look at the exact hour these transfers were executed." I turned the screen toward him. "The firm system requires physical network access for escrow transfers over $50,000, or it requires a verified secondary administrative override. These logs show the user bypassed the secondary protocol from a computer hardwired into your office server here in Savannah." I pointed to the numerical string listed on his own printed sheet. "That is not my IP address." I was sitting at my desk in downtown Atlanta. Here are my building security swipe card records. I entered my corporate tower at 7 in the morning and did not swipe out until 6 at night. I was 250 miles away from that server room. I waited for him to lean forward. I waited for him to inspect the screen. I expected the relief of a father realizing his daughter was innocent of a severe financial crime. He did not even look down. He kept his eyes locked on my face. His jaw muscles clenched tightly under his skin. "Close the computer, Ariana. The proof is right here," I said, tapping the edge of the monitor. "Trace the media access control address on that login. It will point straight to Julian's company laptop. Trace the routing number for the limited liability company. It is a shell account." He slammed his flat hand on the desk. The sound cracked through the room like a gunshot. I said, "Close it." I lowered the screen. The quiet hum of the central air conditioning filled the space between us. He leaned across the leather surface. "You think you can manipulate a spreadsheet to cover your tracks. You think because you passed a few math tests, you can outsmart me in my own business. Julian warned me you would try to blame him." The air in my lungs turned to ice. Julian had not just lied. He had preemptively inoculated my father against the truth. "He caught you." My father continued, his tone dripping with profound disgust. "He found the discrepancies and tried to protect you. He tried to get you to return the funds quietly, but you are a sick, jealous thief." I sat perfectly still. The words hung in the sterile air of the office. Sick, jealous, thief. He delivered the labels with a disturbing ease. He wanted them to be true. He needed them to be true so he could maintain the fiction of his perfect son. Doing the math would mean admitting that the boy he had funded and elevated was a liability who had jeopardized his entire real estate empire. My father built his identity on control. He needed a scapegoat to absorb this failure. He opened a desk drawer and pulled out a single sheet of typed paper. He slid it toward me. It was a drafted confession. It stated that I took the money due to personal financial distress and agreed to repay it in full through direct wage garnishments. Sign it, he ordered. I will not sign a fabricated confession for a crime I did not commit. His face darkened. The false calm vanished, replaced by raw, punitive authority. If you do not sign that paper right now, I will pick up this phone and call the Savannah police. I will hand them the audit logs. They will arrest you for wire fraud. Then I will personally call the Georgia Board of Actuaries and submit a formal ethics complaint. They will strip your professional license before you even go to trial. You will never work in the financial sector again. You will be ruined. He was leveraging my entire future to shield my brother. He was willing to sacrifice my freedom and my career to balance his ledger. I looked down at the drafted confession. The signature line was blank. You would send your own daughter to jail, I stated. It was not a question. You are a threat to this company, he replied. I am protecting my business. Then the punishment shifted from legal extortion to bizarre psychological control. My father operated on dominance. He needed to break my spirit before he felt secure in his victory. You will sign it, he said. And until you figure out how to be a compliant member of this family, you are restricted to your bedroom. You are grounded. I am a 23-year-old woman. I hold a degree in actuarial science. I manage risk portfolios for multinational corporations. And the man sitting across from me was stripping away my adulthood, attempting to reduce me to a disobedient child. You will stay in your room, he continued, dictating the terms, like a judge issuing a sentence. You will not use the family vehicles. You will not interact with the guests arriving tomorrow. And at Thanksgiving dinner in front of the entire family, you will stand up and apologize to Julian for trying to ruin his reputation. You will look your brother in the eye and thank him for his mercy. If you refuse, I make the phone calls on Friday morning. He sat back in his heavy chair and folded his hands over his stomach. He looked satisfied. He thought he had cornered me. He thought the threat of losing my career would force me into submission. He expected me to cry. He expected me to plead for a second chance. I did none of those things. I felt a distinct physical sensation in my chest. People often describe a breaking heart as a sharp pain or an agonizing ache. That is a myth. When a heart truly breaks, when the final thread of attachment snaps, there is no pain at all. There is only a chilling clarity. I looked at the man across the desk. I did not see a father. I did not see a mentor. I saw a warden. He was a man who viewed his children as assets on a balance sheet. Julian was an asset he refused to write off. I was a depreciating asset he was ready to liquidate. I realized that trying to reason with him was a flawed strategy. You cannot present logical evidence to a person who relies on willful ignorance. My father did not care about the truth. He only cared about the narrative. I understand the terms, I said quietly. I did not pick up the pen. I did not sign the confession. I simply stood up. I left the typed document sitting on his desk. I turned and walked out of the office. He called after me, demanding I come back and finish the conversation, but I kept walking. I climbed the stairs to my childhood bedroom. I closed the door. The house was quiet. The trap had closed around me, but my father had made a critical miscalculation. He assumed that stripping away my title as his daughter would leave me helpless. He failed to realize that freeing me from that title also freed me from any remaining loyalty. A warden commands a prisoner through fear. But a prisoner who no longer fears the warden is the most dangerous person in the room. I sat on the edge of my mattress. I looked at the walls I had stared at for 2 decades. The rules of engagement had changed. He had laid out his threats. He had demanded his public apology. He had set the stage for Thanksgiving dinner. He thought he held all the cards because he owned the house we were standing in. He did not know that he was wrong about everything. I reached into my bag and pulled out my phone. I had 48 hours until the turkey was carved. It was time to introduce a variable he never saw coming. I looked at the four walls of my childhood bedroom. My father assumed his authority came from the physical structure surrounding us. He believed he held the ultimate leverage over my compliance because he believed he owned the floor I stood on. People who rely on intimidation rarely verify their power. They simply assume it exists without question. To understand why his assumption was a fatal error, you have to understand the woman who built the foundation he was standing on. Vivian Coleman, my paternal grandmother, was not a woman who baked pies or knitted blankets. She was a matriarch who read commercial balance sheets over her morning black coffee. She built the family wealth alongside my grandfather, transforming a modest local construction outfit into a regional powerhouse. When my grandfather died, she watched her son inherit the title of CEO. And she watched him slowly dilute the company's value with ego-driven development projects and high-interest bridge loans. Vivian saw the decay in our family hierarchy long before anyone else dared to acknowledge it. She observed Julian gliding through his youth on a platinum credit card, offering zero return on investment. She saw my father shielding him from every consequence, cultivating a dangerous entitlement. And she watched me. She saw the quiet, observant girl working the accounting software in the back room, catching the billing errors everyone else ignored. 1 year ago in late November, Vivian was admitted to the oncology ward at Savannah Memorial Hospital. The sterile, fluorescent-lit room became the final staging ground for her legacy. My father and Julian treated her hospital room like a tedious networking obligation. They would visit for 20 minutes, check their luxury watches, discuss the local weather, and invent excuses to return to the golf course. I took the overnight shifts. I sat in the cracked vinyl visitor chair reading actuarial study guides under the harsh reading lamp, listening to the rhythmic hiss of her oxygen machine. I did not ask her for money. I did not ask her for favors. I just sat with her so she would not transition in an empty room. On her final night, her breathing grew shallow. She gestured for me to close the heavy wooden door, shutting out the hallway noise. She reached into her bedside drawer with frail, trembling hands and pulled out a thick, wax-sealed envelope. She did not offer a sentimental goodbye. Her voice was pure iron, stripped of all pretense. She told me my father was going to ruin the family business. She stated it as a mathematical certainty. She said he was over-leveraging his commercial properties to sustain an unsustainable image, and that Julian would eventually drag him down into financial ruin. She handed me the envelope and explicitly instructed me not to open it until I was safely back in my Atlanta apartment. She gave me a business card with a single name printed in raised black lettering. Elias Thorne, attorney at law. She called him a necessary shark. She told me he held the key to my survival, but I had to be patient enough to use it at the precise right moment. She passed away early the next morning. 2 months later, I sat in a high-rise glass corner office in downtown Atlanta, looking out over the sprawling city grid. Elias Thorne sat across from me. He wore a tailored suit and possessed the cold, detached demeanor of a man who dismantles legacies for a living. He did not offer condolences for my loss. He offered a leather-bound portfolio. He opened the binder and explained the legal architecture my grandmother had spent her final months quietly constructing. Vivian did not leave the Savannah family estate to my father. The sprawling multi-million-dollar property with its manicured lawns and grand mahogany staircases was her prized physical asset. She knew if she handed my father the warranty deed, he would immediately borrow against it to fund his failing commercial developments and Julian's escalating lifestyle. She knew the bank would eventually foreclose, leaving the family with nothing. To protect the asset, Vivian bypassed the standard probate process entirely. She executed an irrevocable blind trust. The sole named beneficiary of that trust was me. There was only one specific condition attached to the document. The trust was designed to activate automatically on my 23rd birthday, transferring full legal ownership of the property directly into my name. I sat in Thorne's office processing the raw data. I asked him the obvious question: how did my father not know? How could a man live in a house he did not own without realizing the title had shifted beneath his feet? Thorne offered a sharp, cynical smile. Arrogance, he explained, is a reliable blind spot. When Vivian passed away, my father simply assumed the generational wealth flowed down to the patriarch by default. The estate had been paid off for 2 decades. There was no mortgage company sending monthly statements to trigger his attention. He paid the standard utility bills, kept the landscaping maintained, and walked the halls with the unearned confidence of an owner. He never bothered to check the county recorder's office to verify the deed transfer because his ego could not fathom a scenario where his mother bypassed him. But Chatham County property taxes are a matter of public record, and the government always requires its payment. Elias Thorne acted as the fiduciary shield. The county tax assessments went directly to Thorne's law firm in Atlanta. For the past 6 months, ever since I blew out the candles on my 23rd birthday, Thorne had been forwarding those tax bills to a secure post office box I rented in the city. I paid the property taxes from my own corporate checking account. Every quarter I wired the funds to the county assessor. I filed the receipts in a locked drawer. While my father treated me like a disposable employee, while he ignored my academic achievements, and while he handed Julian the keys to the kingdom, I was quietly paying the taxes on the ground they walked on. I was legally acting as their landlord. My father and my brother were by strict legal definition my tenants. They were living under my roof, and they had no idea. I sat on the edge of my childhood mattress, remembering the confrontation in his home office just an hour prior. I thought about his threat to call the police and ruin my actuarial career over a crime Julian committed. He wanted to strip away my independence to protect a son who stole $68,000. He grounded me in a bedroom I owned. He demanded a public apology at the Thanksgiving table to maintain a fragile, toxic illusion. He tried to play a high-stakes game using my life as collateral. He just did not realize I owned the casino. I reached into my overnight bag and pulled out my laptop. I opened the screen, casting a pale blue light across the dark room. I did not feel fear. I did not feel grief. I felt the cold, precise machinery of justice clicking into place. I pulled up Elias Thorne's direct phone number. It was late, but lawyers like Thorne do not turn off their phones for the holidays. My father demanded I stay in my room until I submitted to his authority. I decided to grant his wish. I would stay in my room. But by the time the sun came up, the authority he relied on would cease to exist. I sat on the edge of the mattress as the sounds of Thanksgiving dinner faded downstairs. I heard the clinking of dessert plates, the muted hum of my father's booming voice holding court, and the occasional burst of laughter from the relatives. They were celebrating a victory. My father had asserted his dominance. Julian had secured his scapegoat. I was safely contained in my room exactly where they wanted me. But containment is an illusion if the prisoner holds the master key. I stood up and pulled my 2 hard-shell suitcases from the closet. I did not pack with the frantic energy of a runaway. I packed with the precision of a corporate executive executing a planned relocation. I folded my slacks, rolled my blouses, and secured my actuarial reference manuals. I deliberately left behind the things my father had purchased for me over the years. A silver necklace, a cashmere sweater, a decorative lamp. Those were items meant to mimic affection and buy leverage. I stripped the room of my actual identity and left only his hollow props behind. The entire packing process took exactly 47 minutes. I sat at my small desk and opened my laptop. My grandmother's trust was the physical weapon, but I needed a financial catalyst. I needed to paralyze my father's ability to fight back before he even knew a war had started. When I turned 18, my father looked at me and recognized a pristine, unblemished credit profile. He did not see a daughter crossing the threshold into adulthood. He saw a zero-risk guarantor. Commercial real estate development relies heavily on bridge loans. These are short-term lending vehicles used to cover the gap between acquiring a property and securing permanent financing. They carry strict terms and require impeccable credit backing. My father's personal credit was leveraged to the absolute limit, stretched painfully thin across multiple failing retail parks. So during my freshman year of college, he placed a stack of loan documents in front of me and told me to sign on the guarantor line. He framed it as a lesson in family loyalty. I opened the secure portal for the regional bank that held his primary commercial debt. I navigated to the guarantor management dashboard. As an actuary, I read financial contracts the way mechanics read engine schematics. I knew the fine print of those bridge loans better than the loan officers who drafted them. There was a specific covenant regarding secondary guarantors. A guarantor could voluntarily withdraw their backing, provided they were not the primary equity holder and submitted the request prior to a default event. Invoking this clause would immediately alter the risk profile of the entire loan. I downloaded the withdrawal authorization forms. I filled in the digital fields. I attached my electronic signature. I clicked submit. I watched the progress bar load, turn green, and flash a confirmation code. That single click triggered a cascading financial collapse. The bank's automated risk management algorithm would detect the missing guarantor profile by midnight. The system would flag the loan as undercapitalized. By the time the bank opened its doors on Monday morning, an automated default notice would be generated and mailed to my father's office. The bank would call the loan demanding full repayment of $1.2 million within 30 days. He did not have $1.2 million. He had a gambling addict for a son and an empty escrow account. I opened a new tab and drafted an email to Elias Thorne. It was not a long email. Lawyers who bill by the hour do not need emotional context. They need actionable directives. I typed a single line. Execute the trust and the eviction. I attached the final property tax receipt I had paid 3 weeks prior. I hit send. The legal machinery my grandmother built was now officially in motion. I closed the laptop and slipped it into my leather tote. I looked at the digital clock on my nightstand. It read 3:14 in the morning. The house was entirely silent. The guests had long since driven back to their own homes. My father and Julian were asleep in their respective wings of the estate, dreaming of a future they no longer possessed. I picked up my suitcases. Before I walked out the bedroom door, I reached into my bag and retrieved a single sheet of paper. It was the printed network login record showing Julian's computer media access control address, accessing the accounting server to steal the $68,000. I placed the paper squarely in the center of the bare mattress. It was a message. It meant I was not running away in shame. It meant I saw the board, I calculated the odds, and I chose to end the game. I navigated the dark hallway. The floorboards near the top of the stairs had a distinct creak, a structural flaw I had memorized when I was 7 years old. I stepped over it effortlessly. I descended the grand mahogany staircase, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. I walked through the foyer, past the antique grandfather clock, and unlocked the heavy front door. The crisp November air hit my face the moment I stepped onto the porch. It carried the scent of salt water from the nearby coastal inlets and the sharp tang of dying autumn leaves. The temperature had dropped, but the chill felt remarkably clean. I walked down the long driveway to my sensible used sedan. I loaded my suitcases into the trunk. I slid into the driver's seat and turned the key. The engine turned over with a steady, reliable hum. I did not turn on the headlights until I reached the street. I shifted into drive and accelerated. I expected to feel a surge of grief. Society conditions us to believe that severing family ties is a tragic, hollow experience. We are taught that walking away from our bloodline should leave us broken. But as the silhouette of the Savannah estate faded in my rearview mirror, I did not feel empty. I felt a profound, overwhelming physical sensation of lightness. The chronic tension in my jaw released. The tight knot in my shoulders unspooled. For 23 years, I had been carrying the weight of my father's fragile ego and my brother's reckless incompetence. I had paid the toll for their comfort with my own peace of mind. Now the debt was canceled. The ledger was clear. I merged onto the interstate heading north toward my own apartment in Atlanta. I had initiated the sequence. I had dropped the match. Now all I had to do was wait for the sun to rise in Savannah. My father would wake up expecting a fractured, apologetic daughter ready to beg for her place at the table. Instead, he would find a ghost, a piece of printed paper, and a man in a tailored suit waiting on his front porch to hand him his own ruin. The sequence of events at the Savannah estate unfolded with mathematical precision. My father is a creature of rigid, unbreakable habit, and Elias Thorne provided me with the exact details of the execution later that afternoon. I can picture the morning with perfect clarity. At 6 o'clock, Richard Coleman woke up. He walked down to the custom chef's kitchen, poured a cup of dark roast coffee, and spread the local business journal across the marble island. He liked the quiet hours of the morning. They gave him a sense of unchecked authority. He fully expected me to walk down those stairs by 7. He anticipated I would emerge from my bedroom, shoulders slumped, carrying the drafted confession he had demanded the day before. He was ready to accept my surrender. He had rehearsed the magnanimous speech he would give, the one where he forgives his errant daughter while reminding her of her perpetual debt to the family. When the grandfather clock in the foyer chimed 8 and I had not appeared, his patience evaporated. He viewed my delay as a final pathetic act of insubordination. He set his coffee mug down, marched up the grand mahogany staircase, and turned the brass handle of my bedroom door. He did not knock. He never knocked. He pushed the door open, ready to issue an ultimatum. Instead, he found a void. The bed was stripped down to the bare white mattress. The closet doors stood open, revealing empty wooden hangers swaying slightly in the draft. The desk was cleared of every textbook, every pen, every trace of my existence. The room looked exactly as it had before we moved into the house 20 years prior. The only item left behind was the single sheet of printed paper I had placed in the exact center of the mattress. The network login record proving Julian accessed the accounting server to steal the escrow funds. My father picked up the paper. He glanced at the numbers, but his brain refused to process the data. He did not see a forensic digital trail. He only saw a daughter rejecting his control. He crumpled the paper in his fist. He walked back downstairs and found Julian in the kitchen. My brother was leaning against the counter, scrolling through his phone, looking for the latest sports betting odds. My father tossed the crumpled paper into the trash bin. "She ran away," my father announced. His tone was dismissive. A scoff echoed in his throat. Julian looked up, masking his profound relief with a practiced sigh. He thought his fabricated narrative had worked flawlessly. He assumed my departure meant I had accepted the role of the guilty party fleeing the scene of the crime. "Let her go," Julian replied. "She is just throwing a tantrum." My father poured a second cup of coffee. He leaned against the marble island, his confidence entirely restored. "She thinks she can survive in the real world without my backing," he said, shaking his head at the perceived absurdity. "Let her pay Atlanta rent prices for a few weeks. She will come crawling back the minute her checking account runs dry. We will change the locks and make her beg for a key." They shared a brief, cynical laugh. They viewed me as a fragile dependent, a secondary character in their story who lacked the financial stamina to endure a harsh reality. They assumed they held all the leverage. They assumed they owned the board. They held that illusion for exactly 1 more hour. At 9 in the morning, sharp, the tires of a black Lincoln Town car crunched against the crushed gravel of the circular driveway. Elias Thorne stepped out of the vehicle. Thorne is a partner at one of the most ruthless estate litigation firms in the state of Georgia. He is a man who routinely dismantles generational trusts, oversees corporate liquidations, and navigates high-conflict divorces for billionaires. He operates with a cold, detached precision. He does not show emotion. But as Thorne walked up the brick pathway toward the sweeping front porch, his hands were trembling. He was not afraid of Richard Coleman. He had dealt with angry, self-important real estate developers countless times. Thorne was trembling because he was unnerved by the sheer lethal perfection of the legal trap he was about to spring. He had reviewed my grandmother Vivian's blind trust a dozen times. He understood the architecture of the snare, but executing it, delivering the final blow on behalf of a 23-year-old actuary who had silently orchestrated this checkmate, left even a seasoned legal veteran shaken by the magnitude of the devastation. Thorne climbed the porch steps. He rang the doorbell. My father opened the heavy wooden door. He wore a crisp polo shirt and a confident smile. He recognized the attorney immediately. My father assumed Thorne was there for routine estate maintenance, perhaps some lingering paperwork regarding Vivian's minor stock portfolios. He extended his hand, playing the role of the gracious Southern host. "Good morning, Elias. What brings you out to the coast? Thorne did not take the offered hand. He stood on the welcome mat, his posture rigid. He held a thick manila envelope against his chest. Richard Thorne said, his voice unusually strained. We need to have a very difficult conversation. My father dropped his hand. The smile faded, replaced by a look of mild irritation. He did not invite the lawyer inside. He stood in the doorway, signaling that he owned the space. I am a busy man today, Elias. Just tell me what documents you need signed. Thorne took a slow breath. He unclasped the manila envelope and pulled out a stack of heavy watermarked legal paper. I do not need your signature, Richard. I am here to execute the final directive of Vivian Coleman's estate. My father crossed his arms. My mother passed away a year ago. The estate is settled. The property transferred to me. That is where you are incorrect, Thorne replied. The words cut through the crisp morning air. Vivian did not leave this property to you. She placed the deed into an irrevocable blind trust. That trust was specifically designed to bypass probate and remain hidden from public commercial record until a designated trigger date. My father stared at him. The concept was so foreign, so deeply contradictory to his worldview, that his brain rejected the information. He let out a harsh bark of laughter. You are mistaken. I am the patriarch of this family. I have lived here for 2 decades. I pay the property taxes. Thorne shook his head. His hands finally steadied as his professional training took over. No, Richard. You do not pay the property taxes. For the last 6 months, the taxes have been paid by the sole legal beneficiary of the blind trust. Thorne handed the top document to my father. It was a certified copy of the warranty deed stamped by the Chatham County Recorder's Office. My father looked down at the paper. His eyes scanned the legal jargon, searching for his own name. He did not find it. Instead, he found my name printed in bold black ink. Ariana Coleman. What is this? My father demanded. His voice lost its booming resonance. It sounded thin, hollow. That is the deed to the property you are standing in, Thorne explained. Your daughter Ariana owns the estate. She owns the land, the structures, and the fixtures. You have no legal claim to this address. Julian appeared in the foyer behind my father. He held a protein shaker bottle. He looked back and forth between the lawyer and our father, sensing the sudden shift in gravity. What is going on, Dad? Julian asked. My father ignored him. He glared at Thorne. This is a clerical error, or a fraud. Ariana is a child. She does not own my house. It is not an error, Richard. It is an ironclad legal reality engineered by your own mother. Thorne reached into the envelope one last time. He pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was not a complex legal document. It was a standard, universally recognized form. Thorne handed the paper to my father. Since you are not the owner of the property, you are legally classified as a month-to-month tenant, Thorne stated. His voice carried the clinical detachment of a surgeon delivering a terminal diagnosis. As the legal representative for the landlord, I am officially serving you and Julian Coleman with a formal 30-day notice to vacate the premises. The words hung in the foyer. Notice to vacate. Eviction. My father looked at the eviction notice. The signature at the bottom was my own, written in precise, unmistakable cursive. The public facade, the indestructible armor of the successful real estate titan, began to fracture in real time. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin an ashen gray. His shoulders dropped. He looked around the grand entryway, taking in the crystal chandelier, the sweeping staircase, the antique clock. For 20 years he had believed this was his kingdom. In a span of 3 minutes, he realized it was just a cage, and I had just changed the locks. Julian stepped forward, looking at the document over my father's shoulder. You cannot do this. We live here. Where are we supposed to go? Thorne stepped back off the porch. That is no longer my client's concern. You have 30 days to remove your personal belongings. If you remain on the property on day 31, the Chatham County Sheriff will arrive to forcibly remove you for trespassing. Thorne turned and walked back toward his waiting town car. My father stood in the doorway, paralyzed. He held the eviction notice in his hands. He thought the loss of his home was the worst thing that could possibly happen to him on a Friday morning. He thought hitting rock bottom meant losing his address. He had no idea the floor was about to drop out entirely. Because Elias Thorne had not just delivered an eviction, he had also brought news from the bank. And the financial ruin waiting for my father was far more devastating than losing a piece of real estate. The silence on the porch stretched heavy and unnatural. My father lowered the eviction notice. The initial shock of losing the estate was still processing in his mind, a slow, toxic drip of realization. He looked at Elias Thorne, searching for a loophole, a negotiation tactic, any familiar tool he could use to regain control. But Thorne was not a man who negotiated. He was a man who delivered consequences. Thorne adjusted his briefcase. He did not retreat to his vehicle. He stood his ground, preparing to deliver the second, far more lethal blow. "That is the civil matter regarding your residency," Richard Thorne said, his tone shifting from firm to clinical. "Now we must address the commercial liabilities." My father frowned. He attempted to pull his authority back around him like a damaged cloak. "My commercial liabilities are none of your concern, Elias. My business is separate from my mother's estate. It became my concern at 3:30 this morning," Thorne replied. "My firm was retained as corporate counsel by Ariana Coleman regarding her guarantor status on your bridge loans." The mention of the bridge loans struck my father physically. He took a short, sharp breath. He understood the fragile architecture of his debt better than anyone. He knew that if a single pillar shifted, the entire structure would collapse. Ariana formally exercised the severability clause in the secondary guarantor agreement, Thorne continued. She submitted the withdrawal authorization to the Regional Lending Consortium. The bank received the notification. Given the current risk profile of your development projects, the automated underwriting system immediately flagged the portfolio as critically undercapitalized. My father stared at the lawyer. The denial was thick, a desperate attempt to reject mathematical certainty. "She cannot do that without my authorization. I am the primary borrower." "She can, and she did," Thorne stated flatly. "You required her to sign as an independent secondary guarantor when she turned 18. You assumed her pristine credit would act as a permanent silent safety net. You failed to read the specific exit provisions tied to independent guarantors who hold zero equity in the primary LLC. She invoked her legal right to withdraw." Julian, who was still standing in the foyer, looked confused. He lacked the financial literacy to grasp the immediate danger. "What does that mean?" Dad Julian asked. "Are they going to raise our interest rates?" Thorne looked at my brother, his expression devoid of pity. "It means, Julian, that the bank is initiating an accelerated call on the principal." Thorne turned his attention back to my father. "The default notice will be couriered to your commercial office by Monday morning. The bank is demanding full repayment of $1.2 million. You have until the end of the business week to secure alternative financing or wire the balance. If you fail to do so, they will begin liquidating the underlying assets and placing liens on your remaining commercial properties." My father leaned against the heavy wooden doorframe. He looked older, smaller, as the reality of the numbers crushed the breath out of him. He did not have $1.2 million in liquid capital. He could not refinance in 5 days. The real estate market was too tight, and his remaining projects were bleeding cash. His empire was built on leverage, and the leverage had just vanished. "She is trying to bankrupt me," my father whispered, the words tasting like ash. "She is doing this because she got caught stealing from the firm. She is trying to create a distraction." Thorne did not react to the accusation. He reached into his briefcase for the final time. He produced a thin blue folder and extended it toward my father. "That brings us to the final matter, Richard. The $68,000 missing from the retail park escrow account." My father grabbed this blue folder. He felt a sudden surge of aggressive validation. "Yes, the escrow funds. She stole the money. Julian proved it. He has the logs. If she thinks she can withdraw her guarantor status and run away to avoid prosecution, she is wrong. I will have her arrested today." Thorne watched my father flip open the blue folder. "You should review those documents carefully before you make any phone calls to the authorities, Richard." My father looked at the pages. They were not the simple internal accounting logs Julian had printed the day before. They were complex multi-page datasets stamped with the seal of a highly accredited independent forensic accounting firm based in Atlanta. Before Ariana left Savannah this morning, she initiated a formal third-party forensic audit of the network intrusion, Thorne explained. She contracted a specialized cybersecurity team to trace the exact pathway of the fraudulent transaction. My father scanned the executive summary. His eyes darted across the text, searching for my name, searching for proof of my guilt. Thorne delivered the findings with ruthless clarity. The audit confirms that Ariana's administrative credentials were used. However, the forensic team traced the physical origin of the login. They bypassed the internal server logs and pulled the raw media access control data directly from the network router. The IP address matches a specific piece of hardware registered to your network. My father stopped reading. He looked up. It was an Alienware gaming laptop, Thorne said, looking directly at Julian. The physical device is currently located in the east wing of this house. Julian took a step backward, his shoulder bumping against the foyer wall. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The blood rushed to his face, a deep, guilty crimson. Thorne continued, his voice steady, dissecting the crime point by point. Furthermore, the forensic team subpoenaed the registration records for Apex Solutions, the dummy LLC, used to receive the stolen funds. The registered agent is a shell corporation in Delaware, but the receiving financial institution is an offshore cryptocurrency exchange. The wallet associated with that exchange is verified under the name Julian Coleman. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of a carefully constructed reality imploding. My father looked at the forensic report in his hands. He looked at the undeniable digitized proof that his golden child was a thief. Then he looked at Julian. Julian raised his hands in a frantic defensive gesture. Dad, it is not what it looks like. She must have planted that evidence. She is a computer genius. She set me up. But my father was a businessman. He understood numbers. He understood forensic audits. And he finally understood the magnitude of his own catastrophic blindness. He had ignored the basic mathematics of the situation. He had chosen to believe a chaotic, poorly constructed lie because it protected his ego. He wanted to believe I was a thief so he could maintain the illusion that his son was a success. In his desperation to shield Julian, he had relentlessly attacked the only person holding his financial life together. He had grounded the owner of the house. He had threatened the guarantor of his loans. He had tried to extort a confession from the one person capable of ordering a forensic audit. Thorne closed his briefcase. The click echoed in the quiet morning air. My client requested I deliver this information as a courtesy, Richard. She wants you to understand precisely why she is withdrawing her financial backing. She will not be a party to wire fraud. If the bank regulators ask why she pulled her guarantor status, she will hand them this audit. Thorne turned and walked down the porch steps. He entered the town car, and the vehicle glided down the driveway, leaving my father and brother alone in a house they no longer owned, facing a debt they could no longer pay. My father stood in the doorway, holding the evidence of his son's betrayal and his own ruin. The shield he had built around Julian was shattered. There was no one left to blame. There was no one left to punish. Julian started speaking a rapid, desperate stream of excuses, but my father slowly raised his hand, demanding silence. The toxicity that had poisoned our family for 2 decades was finally turning inward. The 2 men who had spent their lives using me as a scapegoat were now locked in a cage together, and the walls were rapidly closing in. 3 months later, the Savannah humidity felt like a lifetime away. I was sitting on the balcony of my 22nd floor apartment in downtown Atlanta. The city below was a grid of moving headlights and organized chaos. Have you ever had to cut off toxic blood to save your own life? Drop a comment below. It is the hardest thing you will ever do, but let me tell you what happens when you finally do it. You do not fall. You stand up. My new environment was funded by my recent promotion to senior actuary. When I removed the burden of my father's financial disasters from my mental ledger, my professional output doubled. The firm recognized the shift. They handed me a corner office and a salary that made my old Savannah budget spreadsheet obsolete. My morning routine shifted from survival to intention. Back at the estate, I used to wake up before dawn. I would navigate the hallways, tracing the edges of the carpet to avoid making a sound. I poured my coffee in the dark. I breathed shallowly, anticipating the moment my father would walk into the kitchen to issue his daily criticisms. I spent 23 years bracing for an impact that was always coming. Now, I woke up to sunlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows. I ran an espresso machine that hummed loudly. I played jazz through wireless speakers. I walked flat on my heels. The physical sensation of safety is difficult to articulate if you have never been denied it. It feels like taking a full breath after years of breathing through a straw. There was no one waiting to critique my posture, audit my tone, or demand my gratitude. The only person I owed anything to was myself. But you do not build a new life in a vacuum. You replace the flawed architecture with solid, load-bearing pillars. Sarah was the managing director of my division at the firm. She was a 50-year-old woman who wore tailored blazers and possessed a mind like a steel trap. She did not coddle her employees. She demanded precision. When I first joined the firm fresh out of college, she handed me a notoriously difficult risk assessment portfolio that had broken 2 previous analysts. I finished it in 4 days. She reviewed my work, tapped her pen against the desk, and told me I was underpaid. Sarah became my chosen family. Biological family is an accident of geography and genetics. Chosen family is built on mutual respect. During the fallout of the Thanksgiving eviction, when the adrenaline faded and the logistical realities of securing the trust settled in, Sarah was the one who guided me. She did not offer me empty platitudes. She offered me high-level tax attorneys and a roadmap to navigate the corporate ladder. We had dinner every Tuesday night at a quiet Italian restaurant near the office. She poured the wine and asked me about my projections. She valued my mind. She did not see a scapegoat. She saw a senior actuary capable of mitigating significant financial liabilities. Through Sarah, I learned how to convert my historical pain into functional purpose. The hypervigilance I developed surviving my father transformed into a professional asset. I could spot a flawed data set or a hidden variable faster than anyone in my department because I had spent my childhood scanning rooms for hidden threats. The very traits my father labeled as cold or robotic were the exact skills making me indispensable in the corporate sector. I was no longer a secondary character. I was the architect of my own portfolio. Consider the difference in leadership. When Julian made a mistake, my father buried the evidence and blamed the nearest target. If I made a calculation error in my early days at the firm, Sarah did not yell. She called me into her office, pointed to the spreadsheet, and asked me to explain my methodology. She forced me to defend my logic. When I found the flaw, she nodded, told me to fix it, and moved on. There was no lingering resentment. There was no character assassination. A mistake was simply a data point to be corrected. That level of rational interaction rewired my brain. I stopped operating from a place of fear. I started taking calculated professional risks. I spearheaded a new predictive modeling algorithm for commercial freight loss. The executives adopted it across the entire company. My promotion was not a favor. It was a transaction based on verifiable merit. I earned the luxury apartment. I earned the corner office. I earned the peace. The winter months passed quietly. I sold my sensible used sedan and bought a sleek, reliable import. I furnished my apartment with modern clean lines. No heavy mahogany, no antique clocks ticking away the hours. I chose glass, steel, and light. I created a physical space that reflected my internal clarity. My bank account held the robust savings of a senior executive. The Savannah estate was officially locked, managed by a local property firm Elias Thorne had hired to oversee the eventual sale. I did not check on my father. I did not search for Julian's name in the public arrest records. I simply closed their file. But toxic systems do not dismantle themselves quietly. People who rely on manipulation and control do not accept defeat with grace. When you drop the rope in a tug of war, the person on the other end falls into the mud. And they despise you for making them look foolish. My father and brother had spent 3 months reeling from the financial and legal devastation. They had lost their home. They had lost their leverage. But they still possessed their egos. An ego stripped of its resources relies on the only weapon it has left: fiction. It started on a Tuesday morning in late February. I was sitting in Sarah's office reviewing a quarterly risk projection. My personal cell phone rested on the glass table. It vibrated. I glanced at the screen. It was a text message from an aunt I had not spoken to in 4 years. Then another vibration. A voicemail from a family friend who used to attend our Thanksgiving dinners. Then 3 more notifications in rapid succession. Cousins, uncles, people who had watched me being humiliated and said nothing. They were suddenly very interested in contacting me. I picked up the phone. The messages were not checking on my well-being. They were aggressive. They were demanding answers. My father had realized he could not beat me in a court of law. He could not beat me in a financial audit, so he decided to try and beat me in the court of public opinion. He and Julian had launched a desperate, chaotic smear campaign to rewrite the narrative of their failure. They were using every remaining connection in Savannah to drag me back into the dirt, and my phone was rapidly filling up with their lies. The text messages began arriving at 7 in the morning. By noon, my voicemail inbox was entirely full. The alerts on my phone stacked up like a digital avalanche, vibrating continuously against the glass conference table while I tried to review demographic risk modules. I picked up the device and scrolled through the incoming numbers. I recognized most of them: Aunt Susan, Uncle Robert, a cousin named Mark who had borrowed $3,000 from my father 5 years ago and never paid it back. People who had sat at that Thanksgiving table watched my father scream at me and stared silently at their plates. Now suddenly they found their voices. I tapped the first voicemail icon. It was Aunt Susan. Her tone was shrill, laced with manufactured outrage. "Ariana, your father just called me. I cannot believe you would do something this vindictive, evicting your own flesh and blood because you had a mental breakdown. We always knew you were too stressed working those numbers but stealing your grandmother's house through some legal loophole. You need to come home right now, apologize to Richard, and fix this before you ruin the family reputation forever." I deleted the message. I tapped the next one. Uncle Robert. His voice was patronizing, adopting the deep authoritative cadence he thought men should use when speaking to irrational women. "Listen here, Ariana. You are acting completely out of line. Your father has given you everything. Julian told us how you panicked about work and just snapped. You need to return the deed immediately and get some professional help. Do not make us cut you off." I deleted that one too. The strategy was glaringly obvious. My father and Julian had lost the estate and the commercial funding. They were backed into a financial corner with 0 options. But Richard Coleman was a man whose entire existence relied on public perception. He could not walk into his country club and admit his son was an embezzler and his daughter had legally outmaneuvered him. He needed a narrative that preserved his status as a benevolent patriarch. So he launched a smear campaign. He weaponized the extended family, deploying them like unthinking foot soldiers. Psychologists call these people flying monkeys. They are the enablers, the relatives who refuse to look at objective facts because maintaining the toxic family system is easier than confronting the truth. My father told them I had suffered a catastrophic mental collapse. He claimed my actuarial job in Atlanta had shattered my nerves. He spun a tragic tale where my grandmother Vivian, suffering from dementia in her final days, had been manipulated by me into signing away the Savannah property. He told the family I had exploited a legal technicality to steal the estate and that I had cut off his bridge loans in a fit of paranoid hysteria. Julian naturally played the role of the concerned older brother. He told our cousins that he had tried to intervene, that he had tried to get me psychiatric help, but I had run away in the middle of the night before he could save me. They expected me to react. Toxic systems thrive on engagement. When someone spreads a vicious lie about you, the natural human instinct is to defend yourself. You want to shout the truth. You want to post screenshots, forward forensic audits, and write long emotional paragraphs detailing your innocence. You want to pull on the other end of the rope to prove you are right. But I am an actuary. I understand the concept of diminishing returns. Arguing with people who are committed to misunderstanding you is a bankrupt investment. If I engaged with Aunt Susan or Uncle Robert, I would be acknowledging their authority. I would be stepping back onto their playing field. I sat in my corner office looking at the blinking notification light on my phone. I realized that the ultimate power move against a smear campaign is absolute clinical silence. If someone initiates a tug of war and you simply drop the rope, they fall flat on their face. I opened my contact list. I did not write a group text explaining the forensic audit. I did not defend my mental health. I navigated to Aunt Susan's profile. I tapped block. I moved to Uncle Robert. Block. Cousin Mark. Block. I went down the list, systematically severing digital ties with every relative who left a vitriolic message. I did not feel angry. I felt incredibly efficient. Within 10 minutes, the vibrating stopped. My phone went completely silent. The digital barrage was neutralized. I set the device back on the table and returned to my demographic risk modules. The beauty of my father's smear campaign was that it possessed a fundamental structural flaw. He could tell the extended family whatever he wanted, but he could not tell the bank a story. Financial institutions do not care about family gossip, they care about ledgers. The silence from my end forced the Savannah relatives to look elsewhere for updates, and what they found began to contradict my father's tragic narrative. 2 weeks after the voicemails stopped, the reality of my father's financial collapse breached the public threshold. The Regional Lending Consortium did not accept his excuses. When the business week ended and the $1.2 million balance remained unpaid, the bank initiated commercial foreclosure proceedings. In Savannah, commercial foreclosures are published in the county legal organ. The notices are printed in black and white for every local investor, contractor, and busybody to see. My father's name, his development firm, and the exact addresses of his failing retail parks were listed under public auction notices. The facade cracked. You can convince your sister that your daughter had a mental breakdown, but you cannot convince her that a mental breakdown caused the bank to seize 3 commercial properties simultaneously. The gossip mill in the local real estate community went into overdrive. Contractors who had not been paid started talking. Vendors who were locked out of the escrow accounts filed civil liens against the firm. The illusion of the wealthy, stable patriarch disintegrated in broad daylight. Aunt Susan and Uncle Robert realized that the man they had been defending was sinking fast. The family members who had aggressively attacked me suddenly recognized they were standing on a sinking ship, holding the hand of the captain who steered it into the rocks. My father's attempt to isolate me had failed. The smear campaign collapsed under the weight of objective financial reality. He was out of money, out of property, and rapidly running out of allies. But the collapse of the business was only the first domino. The bank was not the only entity looking closely at Richard Coleman's operations. The missing $68,000 in the escrow account had not been forgotten. A third-party forensic audit is a dangerous document, especially when it lands on the desk of federal regulators. My father was about to learn that protecting Julian came with a price far higher than a damaged reputation. He was about to face the criminal justice system, and the golden child was preparing to betray him. The commercial foreclosure notices were just the visible tremors of a much larger earthquake. The real devastation was happening behind closed doors, driven by men in dark suits who did not care about Savannah gossip or country club reputations. When a regional bank discovers that $68,000 has vanished from a federally insured escrow account, they do not just write off the loss and move on. They are legally obligated to report the discrepancy to regulatory agencies. The bank handed the finalized forensic audit, the exact same audit Elias Thorne had delivered to my father's front porch, directly to the federal authorities. Julian Coleman, the golden boy who had glided through life on a platinum credit card and a manufactured aura of success, woke up one Tuesday morning to find 2 federal agents knocking on the door of his newly rented downsized apartment. They were not there to ask polite questions. They were there to execute a search warrant. They confiscated his gaming laptop, his smartphone, and a stack of financial documents. Julian was formally under investigation for wire fraud. The reality of federal prosecution is vastly different from a stern lecture from a disappointed father. Federal agents do not negotiate. They do not accept tearful apologies or promises to do better next time. They present data, and they demand cooperation. When they sat Julian down in a sterile interrogation room and placed the IP logs, the dummy LLC registration, and the offshore cryptocurrency routing numbers on the steel table, his arrogance evaporated. He saw the math. He saw the inevitable outcome. He was looking at a potential sentence of 5 to 10 years in a federal penitentiary. Julian had spent his entire 25 years avoiding accountability. Whenever he crashed a car, failed a class, or blew through a budget, my father had always been there to absorb the impact and write the check. My father had trained Julian to believe that survival meant finding someone else to take the fall. So when Julian realized he was trapped, he did exactly what he had been conditioned to do. He looked for a scapegoat. Since I was no longer available, he turned to the only other person in the room. Julian turned on his own father. During a formal deposition with federal prosecutors, Julian attempted a desperate, catastrophic pivot. He claimed that he was merely following orders. He spun a new narrative asserting that Richard Coleman, struggling with the crushing weight of impending bridge loan defaults, had ordered his son to siphon the escrow funds to keep the company afloat. Julian stated that my father had instructed him to use my old administrative credentials to create plausible deniability. He painted Richard not as a victim of a rogue employee, but as the mastermind of a corporate embezzlement scheme. The betrayal was absolute. It was the ultimate bitter irony. Richard Coleman had sacrificed his reputation, his business, and his relationship with his daughter to protect his firstborn son. He had stood at a Thanksgiving table and tried to destroy my future just to maintain the illusion of Julian's innocence. And how did the golden child repay 23 years of unconditional protection by actively trying to send his father to federal prison to save his own skin? The toxic dynamic that had sustained our family for 2 decades imploded in spectacular fashion. The two men who had bonded over their shared cruelty toward me were now locked in a vicious legal death match. My father realized far too late that he had not raised a successor. He had raised a parasite. My father was suddenly fighting a war on 2 fronts. He was navigating personal bankruptcy proceedings following the commercial foreclosures, and he was now forced to hire a white-collar criminal defense attorney to fight his own son's allegations. The financial hemorrhage was fatal. He was liquidating his remaining personal assets just to keep his legal team on retainer. That is when my phone rang. It was a Thursday morning. I was sitting at my kitchen island in Atlanta, reviewing a risk assessment matrix for a major shipping client. The caller ID flashed a Savannah area code. I recognized the number. It was my father's cell phone. I did not block it. I let it ring. I wanted to hear the sound of his reality setting in. The call went to voicemail. I pressed the speaker icon and took a sip of my dark roast coffee. The voice that filled my kitchen was unrecognizable. It was not the booming, authoritative tone of the real estate developer who demanded apologies at the Thanksgiving table. It was the ragged, wheezing sound of a broken man. "Ariana, please, pick up the phone." He sounded breathless, panicked. He was weeping. Actual audible sobs echoed through the speaker. "I know I was wrong. I know everything now. Julian is trying to destroy me. He lied to the feds, Ariana. He is trying to say I told him to take the money. I am going to lose everything. They are talking about an indictment." The voicemail continued, a pathetic stream of desperation. "You have to call Elias Thorne. Please. Call off the eviction. Let me stay in the house while I fight this. I do not have anywhere else to go. I cannot afford an apartment and a defense lawyer. I need your help. Please, sweetheart. I am your father." He used the word sweetheart. He had not called me that since I was 8 years old. I listened to the entire 3-minute message. I tracked his breathing patterns. I analyzed the pitch of his voice. I listened to a man who was drowning in a storm he had actively prayed for, begging the daughter he had tried to drown to throw him a life raft. I set my coffee mug down on the granite counter. I felt nothing. There was no satisfaction. There was no vindication. There was certainly no pity. I felt the profound, chilling indifference of an actuary observing a risk variable that had finally reached its statistical conclusion. He was asking me to subsidize his survival after he had tried to bankrupt mine. He wanted me to grant him shelter in the very house he had used as a weapon to control me. He was appealing to a familial bond he had spent 2 decades proving did not exist. I did not delete the voicemail. I saved it to a secure digital folder. Not out of sentimentality, but because in the corporate risk sector, you always archive the data that proves your initial assessment was correct. I tapped the screen and opened an email draft to Elias Thorne. The message was brief. Ensure the sheriff is scheduled for the final eviction date. No extensions will be granted. I hit send. I stood up, rinsed my coffee mug in the sink, and gathered my briefing materials for the morning meeting. I had a shipping client depending on my accuracy, and I refused to let the ghosts of Savannah disrupt my schedule. But Richard Coleman was a man who had never accepted the word no. He had spent his entire life bullying people into submission. If he could not manipulate me from a distance, he would try to force a confrontation on his own terms. He was cornered desperate and running out of time. He assumed his historic ability to charm and intimidate would still work if he could just get me in the same room. He was about to demand a mediation, and I was going to accept it. Not to negotiate, but to deliver the final, undeniable checkmate. The voicemail marked the end of my father's offensive strategy. His smear campaign had collapsed. His commercial empire was actively being dismantled by the bank, and his golden son was actively attempting to build a federal defense case against him. He was out of ammunition, out of allies, and out of time. But Richard Coleman was a man constitutionally incapable of accepting a total loss. He possessed the dangerous optimism of a career manipulator who believes every problem can be solved if he can just get the right person into a room. 4 days after the voicemail, Elias Thorne received a formal notice from the Chatham County Civil Court. My father had petitioned for an emergency mediation hearing regarding the eviction. In Georgia, courts often encourage mediation for familial property disputes before allowing a sheriff to execute a forcible removal, especially when the occupant claims undue hardship. My father was not seeking a legal victory. He knew the trust was ironclad. He was seeking an audience. He requested the mediation under the assumption that if he could just sit across a table from me, he could resurrect the old dynamic. He assumed his physical presence, his booming voice, and his practiced guilt trips would overpower my resolve. He thought he was summoning a scared, disobedient daughter back to Savannah for a final scolding. Thorne called me to discuss the petition. He offered to attend the mediation on my behalf, sparing me the emotional toll of a face-to-face confrontation. He stated we could reject the negotiation and simply wait out the mandatory procedural clock. I declined his offer. I instructed Thorne to accept the mediation date. I was not going to hide in Atlanta while my father attempted to spin a final narrative for a court-appointed mediator. I was going to attend. Not to negotiate the terms of his surrender, but to ensure the surrender was absolute, public, and documented. The preparation for the Chatham County Courthouse required the logistical precision of a military campaign. I treated the upcoming mediation not as a family dispute, but as a high-stakes corporate audit where the opposing party was actively hostile. I spent the weekend in Thorne's high-rise office. We did not discuss emotions. We compiled data. We assembled 3 identical heavy-duty binders. The contents were organized with meticulous care, tabbed and indexed for immediate retrieval. The first section contained the complete certified forensic audit detailing Julian's network intrusion and the dummy offshore LLC. The second section held the bank default notices proving my father's commercial insolvency was entirely separate from the estate transfer. The final section contained the certified warranty deed and the original irrevocable blind trust documents executed by my grandmother Vivian. Every page was a weapon. Every spreadsheet was a shield. We eliminated hearsay and relied exclusively on time-stamped, verifiable reality. The mediation was scheduled for a Tuesday morning. I woke up at 5. I did not feel the familiar sickening knot of anxiety that used to plague my mornings in Savannah. I felt a cold, hyper-focused adrenaline. I selected my wardrobe with deliberate intent. In the corporate sector, attire is a psychological tool. When I lived in my father's house, I wore oversized sweaters and plain slacks, subconsciously attempting to minimize my physical presence. I dressed to be ignored. That morning, I dressed to command the room. I chose a tailored navy blue power suit. The cut was sharp structured and entirely professional. I wore conservative heels that clicked with authority against the hardwood floor. I pulled my hair back into a sleek, severe style. I looked into the mirror and did not recognize the frightened, silent girl who had packed her suitcases in the middle of the night. I saw a senior actuary preparing to present a flawless risk assessment. I drove down the interstate watching the Georgia landscape shift from urban sprawl to coastal pines. The drive took 3.5 hours. It was the exact same route I had driven months prior when my father summoned me to his home office to extort a false confession. But the context had entirely inverted. Savannah used to feel like a suffocating cage. The Spanish moss hanging from the live oaks used to look like heavy curtains closing me in. The historic architecture felt oppressive, a constant reminder of the legacy I was supposed to serve. As I crossed the Talmadge Memorial Bridge and saw the city skyline, the claustrophobia was gone. The city no longer held any power over me. It was simply a geographic location. It was just a stage built for the final act of a play I was about to cancel. I pulled into the parking deck across from the Chatham County Courthouse. The building was an imposing structure of granite and glass, a place designed to resolve conflict through structured procedure. Elias Thorne was waiting for me near the security checkpoint. He wore a charcoal suit and held 2 of the heavy binders. He did not offer a pep talk. He handed me my binder, nodded once, and checked his watch. "We are scheduled for conference room B on the 4th floor," Thorne stated. "The mediator is a retired circuit judge named Harrison. He appreciates brevity and factual evidence." We stepped into the elevator. The metal doors closed, sealing us in the small ascending box. I tightened my grip on the binder. I knew my father would try to derail the proceedings immediately. I knew he would attempt to hijack the narrative before the mediator even sat down. He would use every psychological trick he had honed over 2 decades to make me feel small, ungrateful, and responsible for his ruin. But my father was preparing for a war that had ended 3 months ago. He thought he was walking into a room to discipline a daughter. He had no idea he was walking into a room to face an auditor who held the title to his home, the proof of his son's crimes, and the absolute absence of any remaining fear. The mediation room on the 4th floor of the Chatham County Courthouse was designed to strip away sentimentality. It was a sterile, windowless box, illuminated by harsh fluorescent tubes that hummed with a low, persistent static. A long, scratched mahogany table dominated the center of the space, surrounded by functional black leather rolling chairs. There was no art on the walls. There were no distractions. It was an environment engineered strictly for the resolution of civil conflict. When Elias Thorne and I entered the room at precisely 9 o'clock, my father and Julian were already seated on the far side of the table. The physical toll of the last 3 months was written explicitly across their faces. The indestructible patriarch and his golden son had deteriorated rapidly. My father wore a suit that used to fit him perfectly, but it now hung loosely off his shoulders, the fabric bagging around his collar. His skin carried a grayish pallor, and the deep lines around his eyes were carved deeper by sleepless nights and mounting legal bills. Julian sat beside him, looking frantic and diminished. He possessed the restless, twitchy energy of a cornered animal waiting for the trap to spring. They did not look like titans of coastal real estate. They looked like 2 men who were finally encountering gravity. I did not pause in the doorway. I walked directly to the opposite side of the mahogany table, pulled out a chair, and sat down. Thorne took the seat next to me. I placed my 3 identical heavy-duty binders squarely in front of me, perfectly aligned with the edge of the wood. I folded my hands on top of the covers. My posture was rigid, my expression neutral. A moment later, the door opened again. The court-appointed mediator, a retired circuit judge named Harrison, entered the room. He was a man in his late 60s with silver hair, wire-rimmed glasses, and a demeanor that suggested he had spent 30 years listening to people lie about money. He carried a legal pad and a thermoses of coffee. Harrison took his seat at the head of the table. He uncapped his pen, looked at the case file, and cleared his throat. "Good morning, Harrison," began his voice gravelly and devoid of inflection. "We are here today to discuss the petition regarding the eviction notice served on the property listed in the Vivian Coleman Blind Trust. The petitioner, Richard Coleman, has requested this mediation to resolve the occupancy dispute prior to the execution of a forcible removal order. The respondent, Ariana Coleman, is the documented legal owner of the property. Harrison looked across the table. Mr. Coleman, since you requested this hearing, I will allow you to present your opening statement. What is your proposed resolution to this civil matter? My father took a slow breath. He adjusted his tie and sat up straighter, forcing his shoulders back. I watched the transformation happen in real time. He was attempting to resurrect the public facade. He was summoning the warm, booming, authoritative voice he used at charity banquets and zoning board hearings. He wanted to project the image of a reasonable, benevolent patriarch dealing with a difficult situation. "Thank you, Your Honor," my father said, adopting an air of weary grace. "I appreciate you taking the time to facilitate this. To be perfectly honest, this entire situation is a tragic family misunderstanding, a breakdown in communication." He looked directly at me. He attempted to soften his eyes, manufacturing a look of profound paternal sorrow. "My daughter Ariana has been under a tremendous amount of stress in her corporate career." He continued, his tone dripping with condescension, masked as concern. "When her grandmother passed away, she struggled with the grief. We all did. But Ariana internalized it. She made some rash, unilateral decisions regarding the estate because she felt isolated. I am not here to fight with my daughter. I am here to heal my family. I just want to bring her back into the fold and put this ugliness behind us." It was a masterclass in manipulation. He was playing the role of the long-suffering father, attempting to paint my legal ownership of the property as a symptom of misdirected grief rather than a calculated financial maneuver. He was trying to convince the mediator that I was an emotional liability who needed to be managed, not a landlord executing a lawful eviction. He leaned forward, pressing his chest against the edge of the table. He extended his right arm, reaching his hand across the scratched mahogany toward me. It was a calculated physical gesture designed to force intimacy, a visual cue for the mediator to demonstrate his supposed willingness to reconcile. "Ariana, sweetheart." My father murmured, his voice thick with fabricated emotion. "Please, let us go home. Let us figure this out together." His hand hovered inches from my own, waiting for me to take it. In the past, I would have shrunk away, or I would have grabbed it out of sheer conditioned obedience. I would have played my assigned role in his theater. I did not flinch. I did not pull my hands away quickly. I sat perfectly still in my tailored navy suit. I slowly turned my head and looked down at his outstretched hand. I did not look at it with anger or sadness. I looked at it with the clinical, detached curiosity of a scientist observing a dead insect on a sterile laboratory counter. I held my gaze on his hand for 5 agonizing seconds. I let the silence stretch until it became physically uncomfortable for everyone in the room. The psychological impact of absolute indifference is far more devastating than a shouted insult. When you refuse to react, you strip the manipulator of their power. My father realized I was not going to take the bait. He realized his performance was failing in front of a retired judge. The color rushed into his cheeks, a bright, embarrassed flush. He slowly retracted his arm, pulling his hand back across the table and resting it awkwardly on his knee. The humiliation was palpable. The booming patriarch had been reduced to a man talking to a wall. Mediator Harrison watched the entire interaction without changing his expression. He made a single brief note on his legal pad. He did not offer any sympathetic commentary. Mr. Coleman, Harrison stated dryly, "While I appreciate the desire for familial reconciliation, this court is solely concerned with the legal occupancy of the estate. Do you have a structural proposal regarding the 30-day notice to vacate?" My father swallowed hard, attempting to regain his footing. "I am asking for an extension," he said, his voice losing its warmth, reverting to a strained, defensive register. "Given my current financial hardship, moving abruptly is impossible. I am requesting a minimum of 6 months to secure alternative housing. I believe that is a reasonable request for a father facing eviction from a daughter he raised." Harrison finished writing on his pad. He looked up, turning his attention to my side of the table. "Ms. Coleman," the mediator said, addressing me directly, "your father is requesting a 6-month stay of eviction based on financial hardship. I understand you have prepared an opening statement regarding this petition. You have the floor. I nodded. I did not rush. I unclasped my hands and placed them flat on either side of the first heavy-duty binder. The time for maneuvering was over. My father had tried to spin a narrative about a tragic family misunderstanding. I was about to introduce the mediator to the unassailable mathematics of his crimes. The stage was set, the audience was seated, and I was ready to execute the surgical strike. I opened the first heavy-duty binder. The metal rings snapped apart with a sharp, echoing crack. The sound cut through the low hum of the fluorescent lights like a gavel dropping. I did not look at my father. I kept my eyes locked directly on Mediator Harrison. Your Honor, I began, keeping my voice entirely level. The petitioner is requesting a 6-month stay of eviction based on an alleged temporary financial hardship. I am formally denying that request. Harrison picked up his pen. Go on, Ms. Coleman. The hardship my father describes is not a temporary cash flow problem, I stated. It is a permanent structural collapse resulting from chronic mismanagement and systemic fraud. Granting him a 6-month extension would not allow him to secure alternative housing. It would simply provide him with 6 months of free rent in an asset he has already attempted to illegally leverage. I turned the first page of the binder. My father operates on a strict ledger, I continued. I am an actuary. I evaluate risk using historical data. I will present my case using the exact mathematics he prefers. I pulled a single tabulated spreadsheet from the front pocket and slid it across the scratched mahogany table toward the mediator. Let us establish the financial baseline of this family, I said. For 23 years, resources were allocated based on gender and preference, not merit. When I attended university, I was required to sign for $42,000 in student loans to cover my tuition and basic living expenses. I worked night shifts doing the bookkeeping for my father's commercial firm to buy my own groceries. During that exact same period, my father fully funded my brother's out-of-state tuition, his fraternity dues, and his luxury vehicles without requiring a single receipt or proof of academic attendance. My father opened his mouth to interrupt, his face flushing with indignation, but Harrison raised a single finger, silencing him instantly. I do not bring up the $42,000 to air emotional grievances, I explained to the mediator. I bring it up to demonstrate a verified pattern of financial enablement. My father shielded my brother from every consequence, which cultivated a dangerous sense of entitlement. That entitlement directly caused the current financial insolvency. I turned to the next tab in the binder. I pulled out a stack of bank notices printed on official letterhead. I slid them across the table to sit next to the first spreadsheet. 3 months ago, I exercised my legal right to withdraw as a secondary guarantor on my father's commercial bridge loans, I stated. Because his business was already operating at a critical deficit, the Regional Lending Consortium immediately flagged his portfolio. They issued an accelerated call on the principal. My father currently owes the bank $1.2 million. He has defaulted on that debt. The bank is actively foreclosing on his 3 primary retail parks. Harrison adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses. He picked up the bank notices, his eyes scanning the bold red lettering of the default warnings. He does not have a temporary setback, I clarified. He has a $1.2 million deficit. He has 0 liquid capital, his commercial credit is frozen, and his business is effectively dead. Allowing him to remain in my property poses a severe liability risk to the estate. The room grew colder. The fabricated warmth my father had tried to inject into the mediation was entirely gone, replaced by the freezing reality of empirical data. But a defaulted commercial loan is not the primary reason I am executing this eviction today, I said. I am executing this eviction to protect myself from a criminal conspiracy. I turned to the third tab in my binder. This was the core of the surgical strike. I extracted the thick, certified document stamped by the independent cybersecurity firm. I did not just slide this one across the table. I placed it directly in the center, equidistant between the mediator and my father. 2 weeks before Thanksgiving, the commercial auditors discovered $68,000 missing from a primary escrow account managed by my father's firm. Escrow theft is a federal offense. I looked at Julian. My brother sat frozen in his black leather chair. His eyes were wide, fixated on the certified audit sitting on the wood. He knew exactly what it was. Julian embezzled those funds to cover a severe offshore sports gambling debt. I stated, my voice ringing with staccato precision. To hide his theft, he accessed the firm's network late at night. He used my old administrative bookkeeping credentials. He routed the $68,000 through a dummy consulting vendor and forged my digital signature to bypass the security protocols. He framed me for a federal crime. Julian gripped the armrests of his chair. "That is not true," he stammered, his voice cracking. "She is lying. She set me up." I did not raise my voice. I simply pointed to the document on the table. "That is a certified third-party forensic cybersecurity audit," I told the mediator. "It details the exact digital pathway of the stolen funds. The forensic investigators bypassed the easily manipulated internal server logs. They pulled the raw media access control data directly from the hardware router. The IP address used to steal that money traces exclusively to a gaming laptop registered to Julian Coleman. Furthermore, the dummy vendor account is registered to an offshore cryptocurrency wallet held in Julian's name." Harrison reached out and pulled the forensic audit toward him. He flipped past the executive summary and examined the data tables. A heavy silence descended on the room as the retired judge read the undeniable proof of wire fraud. I finally turned my head and looked directly at my father. He was staring at the table. The confident posture he had assumed 10 minutes prior was gone. He looked like a building that had just suffered a critical structural failure. "You knew," I said to him. My voice was quiet, factual, and lethal. "You looked at the internal logs Julian handed you, and you chose to ignore the inconsistencies. You did not verify the IP addresses. You did not check my security swipe cards in Atlanta. You needed a scapegoat because admitting your hand-picked successor was a thief would destroy your fragile public image." My father slowly shook his head, but he did not speak. His throat worked, swallowing hard against the rising panic. "You summoned me to your home office." I continued, dissecting his psychology in front of the mediator. "You threatened to call the police. You threatened to file a formal ethics complaint and ruin my actuarial license if I did not sign a fabricated confession. You attempted to extort me, and when I refused, you grounded me. You ordered me to stay in my bedroom, and you demanded I stand up at the Thanksgiving dinner table to publicly apologize to the son who stole your money." I leaned forward slightly. I held his gaze. I wanted him to hear every single syllable of his defeat. "You did not ground me because you thought I was a thief," I stated coldly. "You grounded me because holding Julian accountable would mean admitting your legacy is a failure." The words struck him with physical force. I watched the last remaining traces of color drain from Richard Coleman's face. His skin turned a sickly, translucent gray. His jaw worked up and down, his mouth opening and closing, but his vocal cords produced no sound. He was a man who had spent his entire life controlling rooms with volume intimidation and manufactured narratives. Now sitting in a sterile courthouse conference room, he was completely dismantled. He was not dismantled by anger. He was not defeated by a screaming match or an emotional breakdown. He was dismantled by a paper trail he could not manipulate. He looked at the spreadsheets. He looked at the bank default notices. He looked at the forensic cyber audit currently resting in the hands of the court-appointed mediator. He realized the terrifying truth of his situation. He had brought his charm and his booming voice to a gunfight, and I had brought the heavy artillery of raw data. Harrison closed the forensic audit. He set his pen down on his legal pad. He took off his wire-rimmed glasses and looked at my father with a distinct expression of professional disgust. "Mr. Coleman," the mediator said, breaking the suffocating silence. "Based on the documentation provided by the respondent, it appears your request for a 6-month hardship extension is not only unreasonable, it borders on a bad faith filing." The mediator's assessment was the final nail. The authority my father worshipped had just validated his ruin. The public facade he had fought so hard to protect at the expense of his own daughter lay in shattered pieces across the mahogany table. My father slumped back in his rolling chair. The fight left his body. He looked at the harsh fluorescent lights above us, blinking rapidly as his manufactured reality finally surrendered to the math. He was about to break, and the apologies he was preparing to offer would be the most worthless currency he had ever tried to spend. The pronouncement from the retired circuit judge hung in the sterile air of the mediation room, bordering on a bad faith filing. Those words stripped away the final layer of my father's insulation. For his entire adult life, Richard Coleman had relied on the deference of the local legal and business community to validate his status. He expected the mediator to see a respected peer navigating a difficult family dispute. Instead, the mediator looked at him and saw a desperate man attempting to manipulate the court to delay an inevitable eviction. My father stared down at the scratched mahogany table. His shoulders, which he had fought so hard to keep squared and dominant, finally collapsed inward. The tension keeping his posture rigid vanished, leaving him looking hollowed out. A strange, ragged sound escaped his throat. It was a dry, rasping heave, the sound of a man trying to draw breath in a room devoid of oxygen. Then the tears started. They did not fall with the quiet dignity of genuine sorrow. They spilled out in rapid, messy streaks. He wiped at his face with the back of his hand, a clumsy gesture that smeared the moisture across his graying skin. He leaned forward, ignoring the mediator, ignoring Elias Thorne, and ignoring his son. He focused entirely on me. "Ariana, please," he begged. The booming resonance was gone from his voice. It was replaced by a thin, fragile reed of sound. I was wrong. I was so wrong about everything. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. I watched the performance shift from authoritative patriarch to a victim of circumstance. He was about to offer the confession he should have delivered months ago, but he was going to wrap it in 1,000 excuses. "I was drowning in this commercial debt," he continued, his voice wavering. "The retail parks were bleeding cash, and the regional lending consortium was breathing down my neck. When Julian brought me those internal accounting logs, I knew the math was flawed. I saw the inconsistencies. I knew deep down he had taken the escrow money." Julian stopped breathing. The brother who had strutted through life, believing he was untouchable, sat frozen in his black leather chair. He turned his head slowly, staring at the man sitting next to him. "But I was under so much pressure," my father wept, gesturing frantically with his hands. "I wanted to protect the firm. I wanted to protect the family legacy. I panicked. I let him convince me it was you because I could not face the reality that my own son was stealing from me. I made a terrible choice out of fear." "Dad," Julian whispered. The single word cracked in half. "You are throwing me to the wolves." "You stole the money, Julian," my father snapped back, his voice momentarily flashing with old authority before crumbling back into desperation. "You brought the federal investigators to my door. You sat in an interrogation room and told the federal prosecutors I ordered the transfer. You tried to send me to prison to save yourself. You ruined us." The alliance was officially dead. The golden shield was lowered, and the two men who had bonded over their shared cruelty toward me were now tearing each other apart in front of a court-appointed official. Julian looked at the forensic audit resting on the table, then looked at his weeping father. He realized he was entirely alone. The safety net he had relied on for 25 years had just dissolved. My father turned his attention back to me. He folded his hands together like a penitent seeking grace from an altar. "I have lost the business," he pleaded, fresh tears tracking through the deep wrinkles around his eyes. "The bank is auctioning off everything I built. The reputation I spent decades cultivating is gone. I am 62 years old, Ariana. My credit is destroyed. My savings are drained fighting these federal subpoenas." He leaned closer, his chest pressing against the wood. "If you enforce this eviction, I will be living in my car," he said. "You cannot put your own father on the street. Please, forgive me. I know I failed you, but I am begging you to show me mercy. Let me stay in the house. I will pay rent. I will do whatever you ask. I will live in the guest wing. Just give me a chance to make this right." I sat in my tailored navy suit and watched the man who tormented me for 2 decades unravel. I studied his tears. I listened to his pleas for mercy. For 20 years, I had craved an apology from this man. I had spent countless nights in my childhood bedroom calculating what I needed to achieve to earn his respect. I thought if I just scored higher on my actuarial exams or worked longer hours on his accounting ledgers, he would eventually see my value. I had wanted him to look at me and acknowledge I was worthy of his protection. But sitting in the courthouse listening to him beg, I felt a profound, chilling sense of emptiness. The apology held zero currency. I evaluated it the way I evaluate a high-risk insurance claim. It was an unearned asset. He was not apologizing because he felt genuine remorse for grounding me, threatening to ruin my career, or treating me like a disposable utility. He was apologizing because he had run out of other people to blame and he needed a place to sleep. He was attempting to conduct a transaction. He was trying to trade a few tears for free rent in a multi-million-dollar estate. I looked at the man across the table. I felt no anger. I felt no sadness. And I felt no pity. I felt the ultimate unshakable power of detachment. I waited until his sobs subsided into ragged breaths. I did not offer a comforting smile. I did not tell him I forgave him. I reached forward and placed my hands firmly on the cover of my heavy-duty binder. "You did what was easiest to protect your ego, Dad," I stated. The words landed with the heavy, undeniable finality of a gavel striking wood. Now I am doing what is legal to protect my peace. I looked at Elias Thorne. The lawyer nodded once in agreement. I turned my gaze back to my father. "The 30-day notice to vacate stands," I told the room, my voice ringing clear and steady. "Since 3 weeks have already elapsed during this procedural delay, you have exactly 7 days to vacate my property. If you or Julian remain on the premises by next Tuesday morning, the Chatham County Sheriff will arrive to forcibly escort you off the grounds for trespassing." My father stared at me, his mouth open, processing the finality of the sentence. Julian sank lower into his chair, staring blankly at the wall. I stood up. I reached for the cover of the binder. I snapped it shut. The metal rings clicked together with a sharp, echoing snap that finalized the transaction. I picked up my briefcase from the floor. I turned my back on the two men sitting at the mahogany table. I walked toward the door, my heels clicking a steady, confident rhythm against the floor. I walked out of the mediation room, leaving them behind in the sterile light, and I did not look back. The 7-day deadline arrived on a Tuesday morning. The Savannah sky was overcast, casting a flat gray light across the coastal landscape. At exactly 8 o'clock, 2 marked vehicles from the Chatham County Sheriff Department turned onto the crushed gravel driveway of the estate. I was not there to witness the event. I did not need to be. Elias Thorne hired a specialized property management firm to oversee the transition. The lead agent called me from the front lawn to provide a real-time status update. The deputies knocked on the heavy wooden door. They presented the court-validated eviction order. My father and Julian were forced to carry taped cardboard boxes out of the grand foyer, under the silent supervision of law enforcement. The man who had spent 2 decades treating me like a disposable asset spent his final morning in that house loading a rented moving truck. He drove away from the property before noon, surrendering the keys to a hired contractor. The locks were changed an hour later. The physical separation was final, but the eviction was merely the opening act of their consequences. The legal and social fallout arrived with devastating speed. 2 weeks later, a federal grand jury convened in the district court. They reviewed the forensic cybersecurity audit, the bank logs, and the offshore cryptocurrency routing numbers. The evidence was empirical and irrefutable. The grand jury handed down a formal indictment against Julian Coleman. He was charged with 3 counts of federal wire fraud and 1 count of bank fraud. In the United States federal court system, there is no parole. You serve the time the judge assigns. Julian surrendered his passport to a federal magistrate. He was fitted with a GPS ankle monitor pending his trial date. His offshore digital wallet was seized by federal agents. The brother who used to mock my reliance on public transportation is currently living in a cheap extended stay motel near the interstate. He is not allowed to leave the state of Georgia. He spends his days meeting with a public defender because our father can no longer afford to finance private legal counsel. Julian is waiting for a trial that will likely end in a plea agreement for a multi-year prison sentence. The golden child finally encountered a system that my father could not bribe, charm, or manipulate. My father faced a different kind of imprisonment. Richard Coleman relocated to a cramped one-bedroom rental unit in Garden City. It is a heavily industrialized area on the far outskirts of Savannah, bordering a commercial shipping depot. The quiet ticking of the antique grandfather clock was replaced by the constant grinding noise of diesel engines and freight trucks. His reputation in the local real estate sector disintegrated. Savannah is a city built entirely on social currency and perceived wealth. When the board of directors at his exclusive country club realized his commercial loans were in default, and his son was facing federal prosecution, they quietly revoked his membership. The contractors he used to bully stopped returning his phone calls. The local investors who used to attend his lavish dinner parties now crossed the street to avoid making eye contact with him. He became a cautionary tale whispered at zoning board meetings. He is isolated, bankrupt, and stripped of the only thing he ever truly valued. His audience is gone. I did not keep the estate. Holding on to the physical structure would mean paying annual maintenance on a monument to my own mistreatment. I viewed the property as a liquid asset waiting to be converted. I hired a luxury real estate brokerage in Savannah. We listed the property the following month. Because the coastal housing market was experiencing a historic inventory shortage, the estate triggered an immediate bidding war among out-of-state investors. It sold in 14 days, for a significant premium above the initial appraised value. I signed the closing documents from my corporate office in Atlanta. I did not have to travel. A notary verified my signature, and the paperwork was filed electronically. 3 days later, the escrow company wired the funds. I watched the numbers populate on my computer screen. The capital gains were substantial. I did not spend the money on luxury cars or designer clothes. I routed the proceeds into a diversified portfolio of index funds, high-yield bonds, and stable mutual funds. The wealth that my father thought defined his legacy now sits quietly in my investment accounts. It is generating steady compound interest. It will secure my early retirement fund, my future endeavors, and guarantee that I will never have to rely on anyone else for my survival. It has been a year since that Thanksgiving dinner. I am sitting on the balcony of my Atlanta apartment watching the sun set over the city skyline. Sarah, my mentor and chosen family, just completed my annual performance review. I am currently preparing to take over a new division within the firm. My life is quiet, predictable, and incredibly fulfilling. People often ask me if I feel any lingering guilt. Society conditions us to believe that family is an unbreakable bond. We are told from a young age that blood is thicker than water. We are instructed to always leave a door open for the people who raised us, regardless of how much damage they inflict. I reject that premise. Blood does not make a family. Consistency makes a family. Respect makes a family. The active daily choice to protect someone without demanding their subservience makes a family. My grandmother Vivian made that choice when she designed the blind trust. Sarah makes that choice every time she mentors me through a difficult corporate negotiation. My father and brother only ever chose themselves. Forgiveness is a concept that frequently gets weaponized against victims. We are taught that to truly forgive someone, we must allow them back into our lives. That is a dangerous myth. You can forgive a person for your own peace of mind, while simultaneously deciding you never want to speak to them again. You can release the anger without offering an invitation. Forgiveness does not require reconciliation. You do not have to sit at a table with people who tried to dismantle your life. And most importantly, victims owe their abusers nothing. You owe them no explanations. You owe them no second chances. You owe them no unearned apologies. You only owe yourself the courage to walk away. So that is my story. The Thanksgiving dinner that was supposed to break me became the exact moment I secured my freedom. I am 24 years old now. My credit is flawless. My home is my own, and my ledger is perfectly balanced. Thank you for listening to my journey until the very end. If my story resonated with you, or if you recognize your own struggles in these events, please leave a comment below. Tell me about a time you had to enforce a difficult boundary to protect your peace. I read every single one. If you believe in the power of walking away from toxic environments, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps these stories reach the people who need to hear them the most. You have the right to define your own worth. Do not let anyone else calculate your value. Take care of yourselves, and I will see you in the next story.